André Kolingba was, for 12 years from 1981, dictator of the Central African Republic, one of Africa's most troubled states. He had been close to the center of power since the CAR became independent from France in 1960. He had been a key military and political advisor to Jean-Bédel Bokassa, whose disastrous and profligate rule between 1965 and 1979 plunged the CAR into chaos and depravity. Bokassa, who proclaimed himself emperor in 1976, is alleged to have eaten some of his political opponents. After Bokassa was deposed in a coup backed by France and led by the CAR's first president, David Dacko, Kolingba was made army chief of staff. But Dacko had barely been back in office 2 years when Kolingba seized power for himself in September 1981. Even after Kolingba was eventually voted out of office in a presidential election that he reluctantly agreed to 12 years later, he continued to try to scheme a way back into power. He is alleged to have been behind a coup attempt against his elected successor, Ange-Félix Patassé, in 2001, which was put down only after Libyan and Chadian troops intervened in support of the president. Patassé himself only lasted another 2 years before he was in turn overthrown. The bitter rivalry between Kolingba and Patassé was a depressing undercurrent in the recent history of the CAR, which despite considerable mineral, water, and agricultural resources remains one of the world's most underdeveloped nations. André Kolingba was born in 1936 in Bangui, capital of Ubangi-Sheri, part of the Federation of French Equatorial Africa. He was a member of the Yakoma ethnic group, which makes up only 4% of today's CAR population. His teenage years coincided with the post-war period of rapid political change in French Africa spurred by growing demands for self-determination. The territory of Ubangi-Sheri was soon granted its own assembly along with representation in the French Parliament in Paris. Kolingba, like so many future African leaders, saw the military both as a way out of the poverty into which he had been born and a good place to be with independence looming. He joined the French army, transferring on independence in 1960 to the Army of the Central African Republic, the name Ubangi-Sheri then acquired. Kolingba rose through the army ranks in the first few years of the newly independent state, whose first president David Dacko had, by 1962, already turned the CAR into a one-party state. But it was after Bokassa, then Dacko's army commander, seized power in 1965 that Kolingba's career began to take off. He was quickly promoted to colonel and then brigadier general and became one of Bokassa's inner circle of advisors. He served for brief periods as the CAR ambassador to Canada and to the Federal Republic of Germany before Bokassa's grotesque rule was brought to an end by a French-backed coup which restored Dacko to power in 1979. Despite his close association with the ousted Bokassa, Kolingba managed to convince Dacko of his loyalty and was made Army Chief of Staff in July 1981. But within 4 months, and at a time of political unrest and economic decline, he overthrew Dacko in a bloodless coup. He announced the formation of a military committee for national recovery with himself as its chair and suspended the constitution and all political activities. Kolingba, at first at least, appeared to enjoy backing from France and was reported to rely heavily on French military advisors. He survived a coup attempt in 1982, allegedly organized by Patassé, and in 1986 was elected unopposed to a 6-year term as president. A new constitution established a one-party state embodied in the new Central African Democratic Party. The same year, 1986, Bokassa made an unexpected return from exile in France. He was put on trial for murder, including the slaughter of many school children, and was sentenced to death, although this was later commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in an amnesty in 1993 and died 3 years later. Kolingba, meanwhile, was growing increasingly dependent on foreign aid and the IMF to keep the CAR afloat. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, his opponents, encouraged by Patassé from his French exile, became increasingly assertive. Kolingba, under heavy pressure from France, agreed to legalist opposition parties, many of which had already formed a united front against him. Multi-party elections were finally held for parliament and the presidency in October 1992. Kolingba came last in the poll but had the Supreme Court annul the voting on the grounds of alleged irregularities. But he was living on borrowed time, and when the election was rerun in September 1993, Patassé emerged as the clear victor. Surprisingly, given the hostility between the two men, Patassé permitted Kolingba to stay in the car. With strong French and regional backing, Patassé attempted to consolidate the transition to democracy. Kolingba even stood against Patassé in the presidential election of 1999, polling 19% against the incumbent's 51%. But by 2001 Kolingba appeared to have resorted to his old methods. He was accused of being the main plotter in an unsuccessful coup attempt, in which nearly 60 people died. Kolingba fled to Uganda and thousands of his supporters from his Yakoma ethnic group also sought asylum abroad. In his absence he was sentenced to death and stripped of his military rank. Within 2 years Patassé himself was overthrown by his former army chief of staff, General François Bozizé. Previously allied to Kolingba, Bozizé granted the latter an amnesty and he was allowed to return to Bangui. At a reconciliation conference in October 2003, Kolingba publicly asked for forgiveness for the excesses committed during his rule. He was not, however, about to declare an end to his political ambitions and again sought the presidency in elections in 2005, this time finishing third. Kolingba alleged foul play but international observers deemed Bozizé's victory generally fair. Since then, Bozizé has been threatened by a serious rebellion and numerous reported coup attempts, although it is unclear if Kolingba has had any hand in them. André Kolingba, former president of the Central African Republic, was born on August 12, 1936. He died on February 7, 2010, aged 73. André-Dieudonné Kolingba, August 12, 1936 to February 7, 2010, was a Central African politician, who was the fourth president of the Central African Republic, CAR, from September 1, 1981 until October 1, 1993. He took power from President David Dacko in a bloodless coup d'état in 1981 and lost power to Ange-Félix Patassé in a democratic election held in 1993. Kolingba retained the strong support of France until the end of the Cold War in 1992, after which both internal and external pressure forced him to hold presidential elections which he lost. His 12-year term in office saw the growing influence of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank in decisions by donor nations regarding financial support and management of the Central African state. Many members of Kolingba's ethnic group, the Yakoma people, obtained lucrative posts in the public, private and parastatal sectors of the CAR's economy during his era. This gave rise to growing tension between so-called Southerners, including the riverine Yakoma, and Northerners, including the Savannah Baya, in the CAR, which led to violent confrontations between these groups during the Patassé era, 1993 to 2003. In 2001, Kolingba took part in a failed coup attempt against Patassé, after which he temporarily fled to Uganda to evade trial. Early life and education. André-Dieudonné Kolingba was born on August 12, 1936 in Bangui, the capital of the French colony of Ubangui-Chari in French Equatorial Africa. A member of the riverine Yakoma ethnic group, Kolingba, meaning male buffalo, joined the French military in 1954 and received military training at the École de Formation de Officiers Ressortissants de Territoires d'Outre-mer, FORDEM, at Fréjus. He was transferred to the Central African Army at independence in 1960. As a military officer, he also worked at Radio Bangui, where he became a host at the magazine of the Central African Armed Forces and a classical music program, and later was promoted to co-director. While working at the radio, he met his future wife, Mire Kota-Limbora. He became a sub-lieutenant on October 1, 1964, a colonel, and then a brigadier general on April 3, 1973. As a battalion commander, he was named technical advisor to the Minister of National Defense, Veterans, and War Victims on March 1, 1977, as well as aide-de-camp of Bokassa. He then served briefly as the CAR's ambassador to Canada, replacing Sylvester Bongi and the Federal Republic of Germany before being named minister in March 1979. When Bokassa was overthrown in 1979 and David Dacko was restored to power by the French, Kolingba gained Dacko's favor and was made Army Chief of Staff in July 1981. Overthrow of David Dacko. In September 1981, Kolingba overthrew Dacko in a coup d'état. There has been considerable speculation about who supported Kolingba's seizure of power. It has been suggested that local French military advisors helped him carry out the coup without the authorization or knowledge of Socialist President François Mitterrand and his entourage, Delayan 1985, Calc 2004. Central African Republic specialists Richard Bradshaw and Carlos Fandos Rios also state that Kolingba seized power with French support. According to historian Brian Tidley, the 800 French soldiers in the country had orders not to interfere. In 1991, DGSE head Pierre Marion admitted that the French military advisor Jean-Claude Mantillon had played a role in the coup. The French went on to support Kolingba until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the democratization movement in Africa during the late 1980s and early 1990s led to local, French, and international pressure to hold presidential elections. Ruling years. After overthrowing Dacko in 1981, Kolingba established a military committee for national reconstruction to rule the country, but in fact he ruled as a military dictator, more corrupt than brutal, until 1986, when he submitted a constitution to a national referendum. The document was approved with an implausible total of 92%. Under its terms, Kolingba was automatically elected president for a 6-year term. It also established the Central African Democratic Rally, Rassemblement Démocratique Centrafricain, RDC, as the country's only legal party. Parliamentary elections were held in 1987, in which voters were presented with a single list of RDC candidates. With all candidates effectively handpicked by Kolingba, he effectively held complete political control over the country. His regime kept political opponents, for example Abel Gumba, under close surveillance and excluded them from formal politics. Kolingba's government favored fellow Yakoma to hold important administrative, financial, and military posts. This led to the majority of key positions being taken up by Yakoma people. Although disproportionate Yakoma influence already dated back to the colonial era when they worked for Europeans and had access to French education, Amnesty International has stated that nepotism became institutionalized under Kolingba. His years in office further saw the return of Jean-Bédel Bokassa to the Central African Republic. After the latter was tried and sentenced to death in 1987, Kolingba decided to commute this to a life sentence in 1988. With regards to international politics, the country's existing ties with France were maintained or even strengthened. Jean-Claude Mantillon, the STIS and DGSE officer who was implied in the 1981 coup by Marion, had been installed at the head of the Presidential Guard under Dacko shortly before the coup took place. Mantillon maintained this position throughout the entirety of the Kolingba era. This led him to be described as a proconsul and as the president of President Kolingba, implying he was even more powerful than Kolingba himself. The repression of opposition under the Kolingba regime backfired. By 1990, the opposition had united in an alliance, the Comité de Coordination pour la Convocation d'une Conférence Nationale, CCCCN. Internal and external pressures gradually forced Kolingba to open up the regime. In March 1991 he agreed to share power with Edouard Franck, who he named Prime Minister. He also established a commission to make the constitution more democratic and pluralistic. In late 1991, the donor community, most notably a very vocal U.S. ambassador and elements in the French government, finally pressured Kolingba to hold free elections. These took place in 1992, assisted by the UN Electoral Assistance Unit and monitored by international observers. Kolingba finished last, with only 10% of the vote. In response, he had the Constitutional Council declare the election invalid. Kolingba's presidential mandate was due to expire on November 28, 1992, but he carried out a constitutional coup d'état which extended his presidential term for another 90 days. At multiple occasions throughout 1992, the government took violent action against protesters and carried out extrajudicial executions. These included the beating to death of ADP politician Jean-Claude Konyago and the killing of a pregnant woman, Hermine Yakite, on her way to hospital to give birth after she resisted attempts to commandeer her car. Election of Patassé. On February 3, 1993, Kolingba established an interim organ, the National Provisional Political Council of the Republic, Conseil National Politique Provisoire de la République. On February 28, 1993, Gumba, by now leader of the opposition Democratic Forces for Dialogue, Concertation de Forces Démocratiques, announced President Kolingba was no longer president. Unwilling to give in, Kolingba remained in his post, but the group of local donor representatives, Gibafor, notably from the USA and France, forced him to hold proper elections. The same team which the UN Electoral Assistance Unit had provided for the earlier election, and which Kolingba's government caused to fail, was brought in to give its support. Kolingba came in fourth, with only 12% of the vote, well short of a spot in the runoff. Ange-Félix Patassé won the presidency in the second round on September 19, 1993. When Kolingba turned over the presidency to Patassé a month later, it marked the first, and to date only, time since independence when an incumbent president peacefully surrendered power to the opposition. Involvement in 2001 coup attempt. On the night of 27 to 28 May 2001, a coup attempt against President Patassé took place, but failed. 2 days later, Kolingba claimed responsibility for the attempted coup through Radio France Internationale and demanded that Patassé resign and hand over power to him. Patassé reacted by demoting Kolingba and 4 other officers to the rank of private. On June 1, Kolingba called on the other coup plotters to lay down arms and attempted to negotiate with Patassé, which the latter refused. Shortly afterwards, weapons were found in Kolingba's residence. Kolingba fled to Kampala, Uganda, to evade trial. He was found guilty in absentia by the Central African Criminal Court and sentenced to death. 21 of Kolingba's associates, including 3 of his sons, also received a death sentence. Final years and death. Patassé was overthrown in a March 2003 coup by François Bozizé, who declared an amnesty for all those involved in the 2001 coup attempt. Kolingba finally returned to Bangui on October 5, 2003 during the last days of a national conference, Dialogue National, which Bozizé sponsored to promote reconciliation and reconstruction of the country. On October 7, 2003, Kolingba attended the conference and spoke to the delegates, publicly apologizing for the excesses committed during his rule as well as his role in the 2001 coup attempt. He then left for Paris on November 2, 2003 for a prostate operation. Kolingba died there on February 7, 2010. Awards and family. Kolingba married Mireille Kota Limbora Kolingba in 1969, and the couple had 12 children. Kolingba was named Officier de l'Ordre de l'Opération Bokassa, Officer of the Order of the Operation Bokassa, on December 1, 1971, Officier de l'Ordre de la Médaille de la Reconnaissance Centrafricaine, Officer of the Order of the Medal of Central African Gratitude, on January 1, 1972, Chevalier de l'Ordre du Mérite Postal, Knight of the Order of Postal Merit, on December 1, 1972, Commander, January 1, 1975, and Dignité de Grande Croix, Grand Cross, December 1, 1981, de l'Ordre du Mérite Centrafricain, Central African Order of Merit. Thank you for watching this video.